Everyone in Mrs. Fritz's kindergarten class loved their teacher. She gave the best hugs, smiled the nicest smiles, and had the prettiest hair. One day, before recess, a little girl in her class named Elizabeth said something nice to Mrs. Fritz. "I love your curly hair," she said. Mrs. Fritz smiled. "Thank you, Elizabeth. I put something special in my hair every morning." Then Mrs. Fritz left for recess. "Whoa," all the kinders in Mrs. Fritz's kindergarten class said. "What do you think she puts in her hair?" David was the first to speak up. David loved games like dodgeball, tag, and hide-and-seek. The more running and jumping in a game, the better. "I bet she puts springs in her hair," David said. "That's why it's so curly and bouncy. Every morning she rolls her hair around a bunch of springs before she comes to school. That way, if she falls on her head, she just bounces back onto her feet." It sounded right. Mrs. Fritz had springs in her hair, all the kids agreed. All except Lorenzo. Lorenzo was always missing class to visit the dentist. He had more cavities than the whole class combined. "When my mom says she has something special for me, it's not springs," Lorenzo said. "It's candy. Mrs. Fritz puts candy in her hair, so she's always got a snack handy. And I bet if we're all really good, she'll share her candy with us." That sounded so good. Mrs. Fritz must have a special treat for her class, all the kids hoped. All except Maya. Maya was a big fan of detective stories. She took out her magnifying glass and examined Mrs. Fritz's desk. "Mrs. Fritz always has an apple on her desk," Maya observed. "And you know who loves apples, don't you? Horses. Therefore, Mrs. Fritz has a horse living in her hair. She must take it out to ride home." That was logical. Mrs. Fritz had a horse living in her hair, all the kids understood. All except Charles. Charles just moved to the city. He was born on a farm and lived on one all his life. "Horses stink," he said. "Mrs. Fritz always smells so nice, like flowers. She must have flowers in her hair because she likes smelling pretty." That was true. Mrs. Fritz always smelled like flowers, all the kids agreed. All except Adele. Adele sat by the window staring at the sky. Even though it was daytime out, he could see the moon. And that gave him an idea. "What if it's her antenna?" he asked in a frightened whisper. "What's an antenna?" Elizabeth asked. "It's what aliens have sticking out of their head." That was scary. Mrs. Fritz could be an alien hiding her antenna, all the kids worried. All except Alexa. Alexa loved horror stories. She watched them whenever no one was around. The scarier, the better. "If Mrs. Fritz had antennas, she wouldn't have to hide them," she said. "An alien only hides if it's scary. Maybe she has another mouth inside her hair with fangs and 5 tongues and a lot of spit." That was scarier than scary. If Mrs. Fritz was an alien in disguise, she probably was hiding something scary, like a second mouth with fangs and 5 tongues and a lot of spit, all the kids feared. All except Louisa. Louisa's dad was a police officer, and she looked up to heroes like him. "Mrs. Fritz is too nice to be a gross alien," she said. "She's probably a superhero, and she has her cape and costume rolled up inside her hair." That made sense. Mrs. Fritz kept her costume in her hair because she was a superhero, all the kids agreed. All except Dylan. If Dylan could, he would live in the zoo. Animals were so cool to him, the coolest thing ever. "Her hair is this long," he said, holding his hands about 10 inches apart. "That's as long as a young Iowa timber snake. I'll bet she keeps one as a pet in her hair." That could be. Her hair was long enough for a snake to live in it, everyone figured. Everyone except Gabrielle. Gabrielle was a born romantic. She already knew all the words to Romeo and Juliet, and she couldn't even read yet. "My mom says Mrs. means Mrs. Fritz is married," Gabrielle said. "I'll bet she loves Mr. Fritz so much she hides him in her hair and takes him to work with her every day." That was so sweet. Mrs. Fritz must love Mr. Fritz so much she hides him in her hair, everyone thought. Everyone except David, and Lorenzo, and Maya, and Charles, and Adele, and Alexa, and Louisa, and Dylan. "She has springs in her hair," David said. "Then the candy would get all stuck," Lorenzo said. "The horse would eat the candy," Maya said. "A horse that smells like flowers," Charles said. "Maybe her antenna makes you think you're smelling flowers," Adele said. "To lure you closer to her second mouth," Alexa said. "A second mouth isn't a superpower," Louisa said. "Is Mrs. Fritz Super Snake Girl?" Dylan said. I hope the snake doesn't bite Mr. Fritz, Gabrielle said. All the kids started to shout. They were trying so hard to be heard that no one was listening. Mrs. Fritz walked in on her classroom completely out of control. There was so much yelling, Mrs. Fritz couldn't tell who was saying what. What if Mrs. Fritz's horse doesn't get along with her snake? Will Mrs. Fritz's second mouth eat all the candy? Are Mrs. Fritz's flowers and antennae springy? Maybe Mr. Fritz wears the cape and costume in Mrs. Fritz's hair. What's in my hair? Mrs. Fritz asked. The kinders didn't know their teacher was back until right then, when Mrs. Fritz asked exactly the same question they all wanted answered. Is it springs? David asked. Is it candy? Lorenzo asked. Is it a horse? Maya asked. Is it flowers? Charles asked. Is it antenna? Adele asked. Is it a second mouth? Alexa asked. Is it your cape and costume? Louisa asked. Is it a snake? Dylan asked. Is it Mr. Fritz? Gabrielle asked. What are you talking about? Mrs. Fritz asked, her hands on her hips. She had enough of her kinders yelling at her. Everyone went quiet, sorry that they upset their teacher. Then Elizabeth raised her hand. Yes, Elizabeth, Mrs. Fritz asked. You said you put something special in your hair every morning, Elizabeth said. What is it?